have you join us from afar. So, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Kaveh Shahruz. I'm a lawyer and I'm a human rights activist, and I'm really proud to be moderating today's event, which promises to be really engaging and thought-provoking. You didn't really come here to listen to me. You came to listen to these wonderful folks. But I do want to just use my privilege as a moderator just to say something. This event has real special meaning for me generally, and at this moment in particular. I was born in Iran after the 1979 revolution, and I lived in that country through its sort of post-revolution reign of terror, through executions and torture and disappearance of dissidents. But even to the 8-year-old me, and I was 8 years old when the fatwa was announced, I'd witnessed sort of all this horror, but the fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie always felt different, even as a child. And in all the years since then, when I've done a lot of human rights work, that one horrible attack on free speech has always continued to feel different. I know the cruelty of Iran's regime well, but that fatwa against Rushdie was the clerical regime's attempt not just to subjugate its own citizens, but as I think Louise mentioned in the documentary, it was an attempt to spread fear throughout the world. And the message was, no matter where you are in the world, we are going to impose our medieval ideology upon you. So it means a lot to me today to be here to listen to some of the leading figures in this country talk about that. And at this moment in particular, as you know, there's something close to a revolution happening in that country. The people are sickened by the regime's attacks on women, on religious minorities, on ethnic minorities, on independent thinkers, including novelists and artists. It's really meaningful for us to have this event. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to be here with all these people. I am going to introduce our panelists, and I'm going to have to give you abridged versions of their very, very impressive biographies. I'm going to start with the folks on the Zoom. We have the Right Honourable Adrienne Clarkson. She's an accomplished broadcaster, journalist, and distinguished public servant in a multifaceted lifetime. Madam Clarkson was Canada's 26th Governor General from 1999 to 2005. We also have the Honourable Bob Rae, who is the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Canada to the United Nations in New York. He served as Premier of Ontario from 1990 to 1995, interim leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, and was appointed as Canada's Special Envoy to Myanmar and Canada's Special Envoy on Humanitarian and Refugee Issues. He's a Privy Councillor, a Companion of the Order of Canada, and a member of the Order of Ontario. We also have John Ralston Saul. He's an award-winning essayist and novelist. His 16 works have been translated into 29 languages in 38 countries. He is the past president of PEN International, co-chair of the Institute for Canadian Citizenship, and sits on the International Advisory Board for the Common Action Forum. He is a companion to the Order of Canada and has similar honors in Germany and in France. We also have Miss Deepa Mehta, who is very, very kind to be here with us. I understand it's 4 a.m. and she has just landed in New Delhi. So thank you so much for making time, and I understand you may have to leave early, but again, thanks for being here. She is an Oscar-nominated filmmaker whose work is internationally renowned. Her films include the Elemental trilogy, Earth, Fire, and the Best Foreign Language Oscar nominee, Water, Bollywood, Hollywood, Heaven on Earth, and the epic adaptation of Midnight's Children, a clip of which you saw, based on Salman Rushdie's 3-time Booker Prize-winning novel. And then on stage, we have Louise Dennys. She is an award-winning editor and publisher and past president of PEN Canada. She was president of PEN Canada during the event that you saw featured in that documentary. She has worked with 4 Nobel Prize winners and several Booker, Giller, Governor General, and Weston Award winners, including Margaret Atwood, Kazuo Ishiguro, Michael Ondaatje, Toni Morrison, and Yann Martel. She is a member of the Order of Canada. We also have Rick Young. He's widely recognized as a leader in the field of large-scale transformative social change and architect of numerous social change projects within Canada and internationally. He's founder of the Social Project Studio, was a distinguished visiting professor of social innovation at what was then called Ryerson University. He is a fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, awarded the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of his contributions to society, and adopted as a respected Maasai elder. And last but certainly not least, Sturla Gunnarsson is one of Canada's most accomplished filmmakers, and he was the writer and producer of that documentary. His feature films, TV dramas, comedies, and documentary films have received dozens of awards, including an Emmy, the Prix Italia, multiple Canadian Screen Awards and Directors Guild Awards, and an Oscar nomination. His works include the hit comedy Schitt's Creek and films such as Beowulf and Grendel, Rare Birds, and Such a Long Journey. He is a past president of the Directors Guild of Canada. So an unbelievable panel. All right, so let's get into the discussion, and I apologize to all the panelists, incredibly distinguished people, but I'm going to refer to everyone by their first names. I think it just makes everything easier. So in the lead up to this discussion, we had thought about how to approach this, and somebody suggested it would be good to think about this along the lines of the personal, the political, and the social and cultural. So I want to start with the personal. So Louise, you are a good friend of Salman Rushdie. You have been his editor and his publisher. You were brave in being the first to publish the Satanic Verses in paperback. I know everyone in the audience is very concerned for the well-being of Salman Rushdie. There was a report in The Guardian today. Can you tell us about how he's doing?
Yes, the report in The Guardian today, his agent let people know that he was recovering. He was going to lose an eye and the use of one arm. There were 4 stab wounds to the face. There were 15 stab wounds overall in the space of 20 seconds. The liver has been repaired. That was badly perforated. He retained his vocal cords, so happily he will go on speaking. And he is tough-minded and fierce and strong, and though not very robust at his age, he is trying to deal with the trauma of it and come through safely and continue with his work, not only his own writing work, but the work he's been doing over the last 30 years as a major defender of other writers around the world. He's played a key role in that for other people. He himself was president of PEN America to that end. So he's recovering slowly with significant wounds. It was a very brutal attack.
Well, thank you so much for that update. He is in our thoughts, even those of us that don't know him. I want to talk a little bit about the events that we saw portrayed in that documentary, Codename Sally. And Rick, I want to ask you, I know, you were deeply involved in that effort to bring Mr. Rushdie over here. Can you sort of set the scene for us? What was the thought process? Who were the people involved? What is it that led to this incredible, courageous moment?
Yeah, sure. Let me take it back even just a step before that. It was amazing watching that film. Sturla did an extraordinary job. So just try to describe what life was like before the fatwa. You know, that Martin Luther King famous statement about the moral arc of the universe is long, but it seems to bend towards justice. And
we can't really hear. We can't hear, Rick.
Can you hear? Is that all right now?
Put the mic up closer.
Is that all right?
Better now. Better, yeah. Thanks.
So in the moments, in the years leading up to the fatwa, it did feel like the moral arc of the universe was bending in our way towards justice and democracy. And so this, first of all, the demonstrations and the book burning in Bradford, which preceded the fatwa, we were in England at the time, it was just extraordinary, couldn't believe it. And then these claims of blasphemy, it sounded like a blast from the medieval past. I mean, having a friend accused of blasphemy was like hearing that a friend had got scurvy. It just, it just didn't seem possible in our times. So there was such a rupture in the way that the direction of the world seemed to be going. And I'm struck again by watching the film to think about how much that is the case. Then there was such an outpouring, in some ways not enough, but there was an incredible outpouring. It's amazing to look at the list of writers who signed a world statement. It was like reading, it's a list of the greatest writers of the mid-20th century. You had Samuel Beckett was still alive, Eugenia Ionesco, Northrop Frye, Susan Sontag, Toni Morrison, William Golding, and Graham Greene, Louise's uncle, Shisako Endo. Extraordinary list of people. And then there was this, in PEN in the US, PEN America had a gathering and incredible writers, and Susan Sontag was the president of PEN at the time. And I remember that what she said was that what we need to show is a little civic fortitude. A little civic fortitude. And Norman Mailer, who followed her, talked about what would happen if we didn't. And I think it was John who talked in the film about what happens if we don't show that civic fortitude. Louise was in London. She can tell more of that story, but I know that I am devoted to this human being, but this human being—
Happen to be married.
Yeah, we're married for a long time, but Louise in London saying, yes, we will do something, showed that civic fortitude. And then all of our compatriots in this film, and some who are not in the film, like Stephen Lewis, and we approached so early on, and Clay Ruby, who passed away shortly, it's not long ago. Nobody said no. Everybody said, yes, we must do something. Everybody rallied around this idea that something had to be done. Everybody showed enough civic fortitude that this thing happened, because any naysayer along the way who would have said it's not possible, or it's not wise, or somebody else should do it, or Canada can't do it, or we are not significant enough to do it, could have upended this operation. But all of the people in that film, including this one, showed extraordinary civic fortitude.
It's incredible. Thank you. Sturla, I want to come to you and ask you about the genesis of the film. Why did you decide to make it? And, you know, I know you probably talked to everybody for a long time and you had to kind of condense all those conversations. What did you have to leave out? And, you know, what stories do you wish you had more time to tell in this incredible, you know, set of events?
Okay. Do you want to talk about the genesis first? Or
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. The film was directed by my son, Ari, who was really quite influenced by Salman Rushdie. His favorite novel as a child was Haroun and the Sea of the Stories, which is the novel that Salman wrote for his son when he was in hiding. And it's the story of a storyteller and his tormentors. And that sort of launched him into a lifelong relationship, a reader relationship with Salman. He's working on a movie in Vancouver. He sends his regards. He can't be here. For me, I mean, I was at this event, and I thought I was attending an empty chair solidarity event. I was as surprised as everybody when Salman appeared, and it just seemed like it was a very moving moment for me. It felt like a communal moment, sort of a tribal communal moment. And I had also had sort of a long-standing relationship with Salman as a reader. I didn't know him at the time, but I felt that I knew him because his work spoke to me and it made me laugh. And the thought that he could be murdered for writing a novel seemed, as Rick said, it seemed like a blast from the medieval past. So I had this connection that, and I could, that continued on. And then 25 years later, Suzanne Depot called me and she said, we're celebrating the anniversary. She said she was asking for advice, but in retrospect, she used to be my agent, so I know what she was actually up to. And she introduced me to the conspirators here, to Louise and Rick and John and Marion Botsford Fraser, who's not with us today. And they told me the story, and I was just sort of gobsmacked because it seemed like this very powerful story of citizen intervention that made the world a better place. And we live in times when we mostly feel impotent to change events. So, and it also seemed like a profoundly Canadian story, both in sort of the quiet determination of these people, but also in the fact that nobody had ever heard of it. You know, I scoured the internet, there was nothing. And so I realized that if we didn't document it, it would be lost to the mists of time. So I called Ari and I said, you want to direct this? Sure. We phoned some friends, everybody donated their time and their equipment. And we made the film, which is really, I mean, we were just mediums for them to tell their story. And that's how we found ourselves here.
And Sturla, you in turn donated the film to PEN.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
That's wonderful. And Sturla, I do want to actually come back to my second question in a few minutes about sort of things that were not included in the story that maybe you wanted to include, but we'll come back to that. I want to bring Deepa into the conversation. And Deepa, thank you. I may throw a bunch of questions at you because I worry that we may lose you. So this is going to be a multi-part question. Feel free to answer all of it or some parts of it or whatever you like. You're obviously friends with Salman Rushdie. You have worked with him closely. So I just want you to kind of reflect on that friendship and tell me sort of what you think the effect of this fat one going through this experience has been like for Salman Rushdie personally and in terms of his work. And the other thing that I was hoping that you could reflect on was something that he says in the documentary. He talks about the fact that his case got a lot of attention because he was a writer in the UK writing in English. And unfortunately, this kind of thing happens to writers around the world in other countries, and it's not often the focus of much media attention. In your case, I know you have also been on the receiving end of some very sharp attacks from religious nationalists for your Elemental trilogy. So speak to us, if you can, about kind of that point that Salman was making, what it's like to kind of be on the receiving end of attacks and maybe not, the people that receive these kinds of attacks that don't receive this kind of international support, outside of from North Americans and Europeans, and whether you sense that things are getting better or worse in our culture. I know I threw a lot of questions, but I was hoping to get your thoughts on all of those.
If I can remember them, Kaveh, I mean, just okay. Yes, I mean, I consider Salman a dear friend. I tease him at times and say he's like my older brother, and threaten to tie Rakhi, which is what we tie on our brother's thread. I think besides, I mean, he's brilliant, etc., but more than anything else, it's his humanity that has really touched me and my life, and has, in fact, I think, formed a large part of the way I look at people, I look at threats, I deal with the attacks on me. He's always been there. And that's exactly what Louise has said earlier, that he's such a supporter of anybody who's had to go through difficult times. And he told me a lovely story once. And maybe I was telling you, Rick, about it, that he, a long time ago, I think it was in the 80s or something, he had to write an essay on Umberto Eco on his latest book, and he didn't like it, so he wrote he didn't like it, and then he went to a literary festival, and the first person he saw was Umberto, and he said, "Oh my God, I trashed this book, what's going to happen?" And he said, "You know what happened? Umberto Eco opened his arms and he said, 'Salman, you write so well.'" And he said that moment he learned not about graciousness, about actually freedom of expression, and how Umberto Eco, by embracing Salman and gave him a big hug, had proved what we are all trying to talk about. Freedom of expression, I think, has to come with generosity. And that's, I think, Salman for me. Generous, human, very funny, very self-critical. I mean, I know, Louise and Rick know him far better than I do. But, and as for the attacks on me, I mean, water was shut down in India. And fire was, the movie halls were burned. But I mean, similar things have happened to me in Canada. So let's not just go holier than thou, please. And if anybody has been so supportive during the difficult time I had with Funny Boy, it's you, Bob. Bob Bray was fabulous. So there you go. You know, you have somebody who picks up the phone and says, "This is bullshit." I don't know if you're allowed to use bullshit on not. Well, anyway, I did. That's what counts. Who's there when the chips are all down? Who's there when the fatwa happened? It's great that all of you made it possible. And Sturla, you made this wonderful film, and you know you made it possible for Ari to direct it. It's all of that. It's what we care about. I mean, let's finally. It's about like friendship. I mean, even if you don't know anybody, are we going to be when somebody is lonely and alone and feeling threatened from all sides? Who is there? Bob, I'll never, ever forget how wonderful you were. You were just marvelous. So, and this was happening in Canada. So let's not talk about, oh, this happens in India or this happens in Iran. The point is, it's happening all over the world. And I mean, when I think about Canada, I feel, you know, the thing, this is what I about Salman is that, you know, he went from Bombay to England, and I met him in England, and then he went to the United States, and slowly he started feeling safe. But there is no safety anywhere. Somebody asked me the other day, what do you consider is your home, Deepa? And I said, I thought about it, and I you know, like maybe 3 years ago I would have said Canada. 20 years ago I would have said India. And now I say, I would say probably an airplane. So Salman is very important. To come back to that, home, what is home? Home is supposed to be where you're safe, where you can be safe. Certainly United States and the crazies there, or the crazies in Canada, or the ones in India, or the ones in Hungary, or in Brazil. I mean, they're all over. So what do we do? Why are we talking about it? Are we hoping that things will change?
Yeah. So yeah. Thank you for those reflections. I want to. Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that, you know, what you highlight, the fact that this is a global problem is something that I do want to focus on. Maybe Bob, we'll come to you. So a couple of things. One, you know, it took incredible courage on your part to be the first, you know, leader of a government to stand up for Salman Rushdie. So maybe just talk to us a little bit about your reflections there. And then it would be wonderful if you talk about what you see on the international scene now in your role as ambassador to the UN, whether there are forces sort of gathering to limit free expression, whether this mood in the current moment is different than what you saw, you know, in the late 80s, early 90s when the Salman Rushdie affair was playing out.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Deepa for her very generous words. Just to say that I was very lucky to be in the right place at the right time in the early 90s. And I must confess that being premier in the middle of a recession, I didn't always feel that way. But when I was presented with this challenge, initially by my friend Michael Ignatieff, who was phoning me from London saying, how do we get Salman from London to Canada? Because none of the airlines would take him. And so we all worked on that. And lots of people who worked behind the scenes to make that happen. And when he got here, I have to confess something, which members of my cabinet will not be surprised to hear me say. I didn't talk to anybody about it. I didn't ask for anybody's advice. I didn't check to see what they would say, because I knew what they would say. People would say, well, look, they're going to have the event anyway. You don't need to do anything. What other premier is doing this? Has the prime minister done it? And it's going to create reaction in some parts of the the Iranian community and the Muslim community more broadly. So maybe you should just let it go. And I said to myself, imagining this conversation, I said, I'm going to do this because I think it's the right thing to do. And because I have an opportunity to do it. And because I felt that if we did it here in Canada, in our own way, it would have an impact. Because I felt that it was time for it to happen, and then other people would come forward. So I had no hesitation in doing it, and I sort of said, let the chips fall where they may. I can assure you that the chief of my security staff had some words for me when I got back to the office on the next day, saying that this was not going to happen every day, he hoped. And I said, no, but it will happen sometimes, because sometimes we have to do things that speak to freedom. I don't think there's any question. Freedom has always been under threat, because freedom makes people feel uncomfortable. It challenges orthodoxy of all kinds, whether it's the orthodoxy of the right or of the left, whether it's a nationalist orthodoxy or a religious orthodoxy. Freedom of expression challenges that. Humor challenges that. Blasphemy challenges that. So it makes people feel very uncomfortable. But it is, and it isn't always politically popular, because by definition, you're adopting and you're defending a minority. You're defending a minority. That's to say, most people don't agree with you. So I think we have to realize that right now, and I think Rick is right. I think there was a time when we all felt that this is going in the same direction, sort of like the famous, Whig view of history. Everything would get better. Everything would improve. Freedom would, and liberty and democracy would spread slowly but surely everywhere. I think we realized that that's actually not true. That maybe we're not on some linear progression. We're in a continuing battle, and certainly here in New York at the UN, we feel it very strongly. If we criticize the government of China for their treatment of Michael Kovrig, you'd be surprised the number of people who would look the other way. The number of countries that would say, do you really have to make this such a public deal? Can't you do this privately? And I said, no, we can't take an arbitrary detention like the ones that have been perpetrated on the two Michaels as the normal course of events. We don't accept the rules of tyranny. And the same thing's true on Ukraine. Where, I think that the aggression of Russia is as terrible as any aggression we've seen in modern times, and I don't know why we wouldn't be clear about it and talk about it. I think the events around the world, and I think Deepa spoke about this with Funny Boy. Deepa's challenging sexual orthodoxy. She's challenging nationalist orthodoxy, and the orthodoxy of, in fact, two nationalisms that are competing in Sri Lanka. And she's doing it in the name of freedom and freedom of expression, the right of the hero in the story to be himself, to be a gay kid growing up in the community that didn't accept that as a way of life, or way of expression, or way of being in the world. And I think right now, the thing that worries me as much as anything is the treatment of women. We're looking at examples of what I would call gender apartheid in some countries. I think Afghanistan is seized by gender apartheid, where women are made to feel less than fully human. And that's a terrible, terrible thing. And as Deepa has said, others have said, North America is not immune from this. The idea of freedom of speech, the idea of valid information being thoughtfully exchanged is challenged in social media and every form of communication every day. So I think those of us who believe in freedom have to keep fighting for it. And we have to understand that Salman fought for it, believed in it. I don't think he went out of his way to provoke. I think he just was himself. I don't think he meant to insult anybody. He certainly didn't mean to insult religion. He was interested in insulting political orthodoxy and political repression, because that's what he felt was the most terrible thing happening in Iran and elsewhere in the world. And now, when faced with the nationalisms that we see in India and elsewhere, he's fighting that orthodoxy. So we're with Salman. we'll stick with him and keep fighting for him and with him for the things that he believes in.
Mhm.
Here.
Fantastic, Bob. Mhm.
Adrienne, I want to come to you. I mean, you have an exceptionally unique perspective. You've both been, a major cultural figure, but you've not been a political figure, but you've been close to the world of politics in your role as Governor General. And I would love to hear your thoughts on kind of the domestic scene here in Canada, what your sense is of, the freedom of expression here in Canada. What are the forces that are maybe gathering against it, that are pushing back against the freedom of expression, and how that compares to what you saw, in the 90s when, you and others were so courageous in standing up for Salman Rushdie?
Well, look, I had a role in 30 years ago because I'm, John Ralston, Saul's wife, and I was seeing him crammed into small phone booths with the most beautiful woman in Toronto, Louise, Dennys, and making calls to London and being a part of that, which was great fun. And because we knew we were doing something positive. But I want to take a little step sort of with a bigger lens. I see that event in 92 and I think it will be seen in the future, and there will be doctoral theses written about it, as a kind of culmination of a Pearson generation of people. The people you're seeing here are people who were brought up at the time when Lester Pearson and the role that Canada played in the world was defined by something that Pearson stood for. And Bob Rae is the son of Saul Rae, who was an outstanding ambassador in the Pearson time and previous to, of the generation a little younger than Pearson. And our role then, and the kind of ethos that we all grew up with in the 50s and 60s and 70s, was that we as Canada could do something because Lester Pearson, this mild-mannered son of a Methodist minister, come out of the First World War and became our foreign affairs minister and put us on the map because we were Canadian and we had certain kinds of values, and people like Saul Rae, Bob's father, helped him do that. The people of that generation were the ones that we, when we were at university, looked up to. We thought, if they can do things like that, then we can go out in the world and we can be in Canada, and we can define those freedoms and those necessities, and we can go out and help the world. And that's why World University Services was started. That's why we all went out. Stephen Lewis went to Africa in 1961 because there was a dimension there that he wanted to create. Then he came back to Canada and did things domestically. That was our generation. And historically, we will be looking at that whole period together. And I think this event in 1992 that we were involved with will really be something that shines out like a little jewel in it, because it brings together all of those values, the things that, how did Canada do it? Why did they do it? We didn't do it alone. We didn't do it because we were all terrific members of PEN, which I think we are, and because we cared, and because we would go, Bill Glasgow and I went on a mission during the dictatorship in Chile, and it was risky, but we did it, and we came back and gave our reports, and that helped, I think, to further the cause of freedom of expression, and made the Chileans, I think it bolstered them, and they voted for freedom, and that made a change. All those things that PEN did and that we were involved with for those decades, they count up. And then, Bob becomes the Premier of Ontario. He didn't have to come out and do what he did, as he says. Right. He did not have to. And in fact, the wise thing would have been for him not to, because he was being criticized left, right, and center for all sorts of things. The last thing in the world he needed was to come out, and do that. And everybody's saying no, and he has the courage to do it. And he has the courage to do it because there's a whole thing around him, not only his own personal history with his father, but all of that history of what we were as a country in the post-war period from 1945 until, I would say, we'll say till the late 80s or maybe into the 90s. But what we were part of was a kind of apex there. And I think that freedom of expression is only part of what we can be and are as people, because that stands for a lot. That stands for what Bob was talking about, the women's rights and how women are being suppressed now. And you see it in the United States with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the horrors of all of that, taking away agency from people. That is what we're talking about in freedom of expression. We're taking away agency from people. And so I see it in a larger picture, and I'm very, very proud that I had such a tiny part in it, but I will remember it always.
Well, thank you. John, in that documentary, you say something that really resonated, and I watched it a few days ago, and I've been thinking about it ever since. You mentioned freedom of expression is not something you just stand up for once. It's something you kind of have to do day in and day out. And I'd love to hear you kind of explain that a little bit more, and also put it in the context of something I've been thinking about, and I know other panelists have been thinking about, is whether or not we have kind of lost that ability to practice free expression over and over again, whether or not we have internalized the fatwa. We're seeing attacks on free expression from both the right and also, as Salman mentions in the film, from the left increasingly. Have we lost that ability, and if so, how do we recover it? I'd love to hear your thoughts, and then I think that's a question that all the other panelists, if they wish to weigh in on, would love to hear their thoughts.
Well, I don't think we've lost it, but it's something you have to practice. You really have to practice it every single day. I mean, let me just go back to that night 30 years ago. None of the people who were on in the first half, about 50 people all told, I think, knew what was going to happen. And in the intermission, if I remember rightly, Louise and Marion and myself gathered them all behind the curtain and said, look, this is what's about to happen. A number of people, remember, had been stabbed and killed already. We said, you've got children, you've got families. Anybody who doesn't want to sit on the stage, there's no shame in it. We won't worry about that. You just don't do it, because of course everybody did it. But what was so interesting was they were absolutely determined to do it. There was absolutely no hesitation. So maybe that was the innocence of the time, in spite of the fact that had already been the murders and the attacks. I do think that freedom of expression was the beginning of the attacks on it, of that line in the wrong direction, was beginning then. We were all very self-confident going in one direction, but there's a thing going in the other direction at the very same time, which was freedom of expression. The attack on it was beginning to happen, and people were beginning to say that it was a kind of indulgence of, middle-class intellectuals, and it didn't really matter all that much, and that other things mattered, and a sort of denial of the history of the centrality of freedom of expression, not just for people like us, this little group, but for every single citizen, that it is in fact the basis of any form of democracy, the ability of every single person to feel that when they wake up in the morning and they open the door and they walk out of their apartment or their house, that they begin to use their freedom of expression, which is, you're on the bus and you see somebody being rude and you intervene on behalf of the person who's been insulted, who might be older or might be as strong. You have to intervene at every second of the day. Freedom of expression is not, it doesn't start, everybody sort of thinks it's like in the movies, you wait for that grand moment. Suddenly you're an accountant and suddenly something happens, and a dramatic moment, and by the end of the movie, you learn to do the thing that needs to be done. That's not how it happens at all. It happens because in your office, on the street, in the bus, anywhere, that littlest thing, you have to be willing to stand up and say something and intervene on everything under the sun about your street, about your city, about your neighbors, about living together. And if you don't do that, when the big moment comes, you just won't be ready for it. You won't have the kind of the practice that you need. And what was so interesting with all those people behind the curtains, most of them had never been asked to do anything that actually required risking their lives. And you could feel there was a little kind of silent rumble. I don't know if Louise would agree, a sort of silent rumble among them all. And they sort of felt, I can do this. And they did it. And as I say, maybe it was a bit naive, but I think, you know, today it seems to be harder and harder. People feel that freedom of expression is something that's tougher and tougher to do. And in my, 6 years as president of PEN International, I traveled 70% of the time, going from country to country to country where freedom of expression was in danger or literally almost didn't exist. And you saw the astonishing courage of people in Myanmar, just to take a single example, where every day when these people went out, they could be arrested for saying the simplest thing, for reciting a poem, for going into a village, but they were doing it anyway. And you really learned as a Westerner, the kind of humility when you see these people doing these things and not knowing when they go home, they'll be fired, then they'll be arrested, then they'll be tortured, then they'll disappear. And that's just the way most people's lives really are. I remember once when I was president of PEN, getting a phone call on a Sunday from a leading writer in a Central American country saying he'd spoken up. And there were a bunch of gunmen circling his house with machine guns. And the reason they were circling was before they killed him, they wanted to make sure that as many people in the city knew that it was a premeditated killing and they better keep their mouths shut. And he just phoned in despair. He had my phone number, and I'm sitting there in Toronto thinking, well, what, you know, you could imagine, what do you do? And the only thing I could think to do was we put the system, the PEN system into motion, and we got it into as many online television, radio, online things as possible. So that within a half an hour, it was a noise all over the place, including where he was. And it started to be felt. People started driving their cars down to this guy's house to be there so that the killers couldn't kill him without witnesses. And eventually they withdrew. And so you know, I didn't do anything. I just made some phone calls sitting in Toronto. But what these people in the area did was they got in their cars and they went there and made their presence felt, and they stopped him from being killed. And that's what it's like in most countries. I promise you, you go around and people are living on the edge everywhere. And that's the thing we're not conscious enough of. And that's freedom of expression is the basis of everything we do. It is not an elite proposal. It is the citizens, the basis of the citizens' power in any society.
Louise, I know you wanted to follow up on that.
I just want to support completely what John has just said so well. And there are a couple of things to point out. One that I'd like to mention, one that to be a writer, filmmaker, journalist in the modern world, and in fact, always, you have to be fearless. And to be a good citizen, you have to be fearless if you are there to be part of a community and to be part of a good community that you want to uphold. So those two things run together. John says it's not elite, it's about being a citizen. I'm kind of looking at him down here. So the other thing, though, is in terms of the question too, in terms of what's happening in Canada as well as around the world and how we've internalized the fatwa. I think what Salman said about there being a straight line from the fatwa, which was the first major incident of its kind in the world where a state reached out with apparent impunity to target a citizen of another country, to the towers, that straight line to the towers. And on top of that, the internalizing of the idea that you could repress with impunity. You could repress others with impunity. And we've internalized it in odd ways. We see it today in Canada in a particular way, or I see it as a book publisher in a particular way, perhaps, which is that the banning of books and self-censorship has increased in Canada over the last few years, and particularly over the last couple of years. It's increased hugely in the United States, but it has also really escalated in Canada. And it's mostly, it's individuals, but it's also communities coming to say, I don't like this particular book. I don't want it in the public library. It has to be removed. And people then faced with the decision whether to stand up to your community, whether to stand up possibly to your donors, etc. And this, of course, is happening in schools as well, in the public schools, and say, no, this has to stay. I mean, the Supreme Court of Canada would defend that position of it has to stay under our laws, but there is a kind of willingness to turn over, willingness to back off and not say no to something that you know is wrong. I mean, The Handmaid's Tale is banned, Mouse is banned, Art Spiegelman's brilliant graphic novel. I mean, Alice Munro is banned in areas where people don't happen to like it. It's happening to an increasing extent.
Thank you. Rick, I know you have some thoughts.
Yeah, you know, back then, when not the time of the film, but the time of the caper, we can think about it with an ironic distance now. Honestly, we felt that threats to these kind of freedoms were in distant places and maybe distant times. And we knew people. I mean, I'm very struck actually by what Adrienne said. And very quick aside, but I've never seen anybody work harder behind the scenes. Adrienne said she played a very small role. When we were in Ottawa, Adrienne mobilized and marshaled the entire press corps of Canada and was just one of the hardest working people I've ever seen, along with Louise. But it was much more than a small role that Adrienne played. But we knew people. Look, you know, I grew up in Canada just after the war. I'm, you know, one of the lucky people who I think has always been like my generation and people who grew up in our culture, a little bit unappreciative of being a guest in the House of Freedom, because we have an extraordinary House of Freedom here. And the assaults on those freedoms were elsewhere. And, you know, Louise published Joseph Skretsky, a Czech writer, Czechoslovakian writer who had come to Canada, who ran a samizdat press. We knew of Jacobo Timmerman, we knew of Solzhenitsyn, you know, we knew of the writers, and we knew some of the writers who had been persecuted. We knew people who'd been put in jail. It was elsewhere. It was not the soil of our culture that bred those things. But now it is. And when we say that we've internalized the fatwa, we've grown lax in our ability to defend against it. It takes muscle, and it takes moral muscle, and it takes democratic muscle, which we have forgotten. I think there will always be a wills to power. There will always be tyrants. There will always be psychopaths. I think nature and history shows us that you know, those kind of personalities will be kicked up, and they're very dangerous people. But the most dangerous thing is not those monsters. It's the bystanders among us, and most of us are willing bystanders and don't have the civic fortitude to say, we have to say something and do something. And it's not grand acts of heroism. It's to say, when our hearts feel that something isn't right, is to speak against that. And we don't. And we all cower. And, you know, I would recommend to everybody to read the extraordinary essay by Václav Havel, The Power of the Powerless, to understand how those regimes of tyranny work, because how they work are not just by oppressive tyrants and by police forces, not by the mullahs or the SAVAK that preceded them, but by human beings who are citizens who let those kind of acts pass, and they pass slowly at first, and then before you know it, you have got power so entrenched and tyranny so entrenched that the quantum of opposition is gargantuan.
Beautifully said. Thank you. Maybe on that note, there's a million other things that I want to ask about, but I want to turn it over to the audience. Maybe let's just take a couple of very short questions and shout it out. Yeah, can we get the lights up just a little bit?
Thank you for the panel and thank you for the movie. It was fantastic. I had a question directed towards Adrienne, but if John or Deepa or Louise would like to jump in, I think it's relevant too. The movie and most of the discussion has been about the role of novelists and writers in advancing freedom of expression. Adrienne, I wanted to know if you wanted to speak to your experience as a journalist doing the same, and maybe what the similarities and differences between journalism and prose or fiction writing in defending and advancing freedom of expression. And John, Deepa, and Louise involved in that industry, if you could speak on your experience.
Great. Thank you for that question. I don't know if the folks on Zoom heard it. Adrienne, that question was
Yeah,
primarily
we
directed at you, but
are-
possibly others.
Yeah.
Oh, you have heard it. Okay. Go ahead.
I think there's no difference about defending, having freedom of the speech between journalists and writers. In fact, PEN, and John can speak to this, is defending journalists all the time, bloggers, all kinds of people who decide they're going to speak out of their private realm. All we're talking about is the ability to say things outside of your private realm in the safety of your own home or little network. Anytime you decide you're going to do anything publicly, then that is expression, and that is where you should be allowed to have freedom of expression and to have it as much as openly as possible. And that's why I think we nowadays we're seeing not only people saying, let's take Alice Munro off the shelves because we don't like that particular story that describes women in this particular way or whatever, but we're seeing libraries being boycotted because they have certain speakers come and people think, no, those speakers shouldn't be allowed to speak about their book about this particular subject. And they ask the librarian, the programmers not to program those people. And people who do not bend to that, and I think are very courageous, because public libraries are public libraries. They depend upon the public going to them. They depend upon cities supporting them with funds. And if somebody says, that librarian let so-and-so say these things and they shouldn't have, and therefore it was a bad thing for the city. And often, you'll see people bending to that, and they should not. I think that journalism is very important as part of freedom of expression, and we're finding new ways of that happening, that people are able to express themselves. And I think whether it means standing on a little soapbox on Hyde Park Corner, which was originally the way people said, oh, no, just people go and do that and it's crazy or whatever. People should be allowed to say it if they're crazy. I mean, it's their responsibility. It's not our responsibility to say you are crazy unless they have attempted to do something that is against the law, that is criminal, that they attempt to stab somebody at the same time that they're talking. And anybody should be allowed to say whatever they want, and anybody should be free to say, I don't agree with you. That is the bottom line.
If I could just add into that, I mean, I think there was a time when PEN International sort of, well, it was the writers and it was a bit grand and all the rest of it. And it slowly, as this crisis got bigger and bigger, it was clear that it wasn't going to work that way anymore. It wasn't enough that a famous or a Nobel Prize winner would stand up, and that and you looked around the world and you realized that in every country, in every area, different people in different parts of the writing world were at the front line. It wasn't always, sometimes it was a poet, sometimes it was novelist, sometimes it was journalist, sometimes, so that really, when I became President PEN, we talked about it and we said the time is over for the divisions. Freedom of expression is freedom of expression. We have to speak up for everybody and we'll work with everybody. And the result now is that the international movement, which defends freedom of expression, is very unified and speaks up without any idea of, this is more important than that, or we don't include those people. And, you go to some countries and it's the poets. It's the poets. And as it once was in the West, you go to other places and it's poverty-stricken regional journalists, and you've got to find them and speak up for them. It's not always people that are known even in their own capitals. You've got to be there for them, and it's really tough. It's hard work, but they need to be backed, and you've got to find where the front line of freedom of expression is in that particular place.
I just want to add one other thought, and that is that freedom of association is a key part of freedom of expression. So historically, in many parts of the world, the ability of people to organize trade union movements, social movements, have been a critical part of what we understand, what we mean by freedom, and why freedom is not just an individual movement. It's a social movement, because you have to create the institutions that allow freedom to be strong, and it's all of those institutional bases of freedom, as is freedom of religion. Freedom of religion is a very important part of free expression, and the freedom to have no religion is pretty critical. So these things all go together, and they're invariably political, and they are challenged by those who are more comfortable with authority and more comfortable with in extreme forms of authoritarianism, and freedom stands opposed to those. But it's no accident that the people who are against freedom of expression are also against freedom of association.
Yeah.
They're also against devolution of
Absolutely.
power. They're also against other ways in which people are able to express themselves. They're also against freedom of movement.
Of
One of the
course.
most important ways in which authoritarian systems operate is to prevent people from going from A to B. So you need a pass. And we did that. We, non-Indigenous people, did it in Canada. We had a pass system that was imposed on Indigenous people. It's a very important way of suppressing their freedom of expression, their freedom to be themselves individually and collectively. And these things all go together. And that's the fight we find ourselves in at home, and it's the fight we find ourselves in everywhere in the world. There's no difference between it. We don't have to say, I want to only concentrate on Canada, or I'm only worried about this country or the other country. Let me tell you, it's everywhere.
Right.
And we have to understand the universality of that idea. And the concept of universal rights is the premise upon which the United Nations is founded. That's the deal that was made, to say we believe in universal freedoms. We believe these freedoms are inherent in the human personality and in human life. And that's the battle we're in right now.
And that was drafted by Canadian John Humphreys.
Yes.
Right? So, we are right in it as Canadians. Let's not think that because we're not that big a country, or we have, whatever, that we drafted that UN Declaration of Human Rights, John Humphreys, and did that. And we should be, as Canadians, very, very proud of that, and be the ones who support it most of all.
Absolutely. I've been given the sign that we're almost out of time. So but I do want to give everybody a chance to sort of give a concluding thought. So Louise, maybe let's start with you.
I just wanted quickly to say that I thought the question was very good, to add to what John and Bob are saying in terms of journalists. And John himself knows, as a recent president of International PEN, that being a journalist in the world today, being a writer, but especially being a journalist, is, I think the expression is, John, it's now by the numbers, the riskiest profession in the world, above military, above anything else. And also that, where, just another point of what Bob was saying, that Salman was attacked in Chautauqua at a debate about, at a discussion, not even a debate, about protecting the right of exiles to come to the United States, talking to America as a place of refuge for exiles and writers in exile. And PEN has now become the immigration side of this, with the migrations flowing across the world, the desire to stop migration, the need for people to migrate for countless reasons, and for writers and people who wish to express themselves or associate as they wish, is what someone was talking about at Chautauqua.
Wonderful. Rick?
And if I could just put on top of what Louise said, just to be precise, that there is absolutely no question the single most dangerous profession in the world today is not being in the military. It's being a writer or a journalist. They're putting all of that together. And I forget what the exact numbers are, but I think there are something like, There are hundreds of writers in prison around the world, and there are hundreds of writers killed. That includes journalists, etc., being killed every year around the world. It's an incredibly dangerous profession. And then in places like our countries, often what's used is libel laws, and they're sued into bankruptcy.
Self-censorship.
And therefore, self-censorship, because you're terrified, and your publishers are rightly terrified that they're going to be faced by a multi-year suit, which is going to cost them hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and will bankrupt the writer. And this libel chill is incredibly important in the Western democracies as a censorship tool by people who have power of one sort or another.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rick?
You know, we think about freedom of expression and we think about writers, artists. Of course, it's not just writers, but filmmakers, musicians, there's music that's banned. But in the end, it's all of us and all of you and everything that you feel. We cannot be we cannot be participants in a democracy or any form of community without our intersubjectivity. It's actually, I want to bring it back to what we saw at the beginning, the opening of Deepa's film, of Salman's book. You know, who we are is the ongoing story that we try to tell. Who we are together is the ongoing challenge. Even more dangerous than being a writer is being alive in our times. And without freedom of expression, to feel what we feel, to know truths in our hearts and be able to express those to others, what if we suppress our own freedoms, not because there are others who want to shut us up or stick knives in our necks and eyes and hands, but because we impose those sanctions on ourselves because we are afraid to be who we are. That is how the fatwa has been internalized, and that's what we all have to stand against. The freedom of expression and the fight for the freedom of expression is not just for those heroic and famous people that we know, it's for all of us.
Brilliantly put. Sturla?
Writing is the act of figuring out what you believe. And I just want to pick up briefly on what Salman says at the end of the film when he talks about sort of the legacy of this is the legacy of self-censorship. And that belongs to the you know, in North America, it belongs to the, you know, the Christian right and the identity left are equally guilty. You know, we have a situation now in this country where we have the funding agencies in Canada have subcommittees to determine authenticity of voice, where the broadcasters adhere to a protocol that determines who can write what about Indigenous people. These are, you know, I don't want to compare this to, and I want to be very careful, I don't want to compare this to people being assaulted and murdered and imprisoned. But I do think that it's important to remember, for all of us to remember, that that we have to have the courage to speak truthfully and to figure out what we believe. And we have to recognize the fact that if we allow the censor into our brain, it becomes a very, very difficult thing to do.
Thank you. Deepa, I want to give you the last word. Your thoughts on this issue.
I think what comes to mind is a quote from Brecht, and this is from where you stop, Sturla. And the quote goes like, "Art is not what mirrors reality, but it's a hammer that shapes it." And where does censorship fit into that? How does it fit into that? Can we actually be the hammer? Shouldn't we all be the hammer? Or do we have to belong to a particular group in order to represent that group? How does it all work? I don't know. So it's a question for everybody. Where has it gone? When we talk about freedom of expression, are we talking about a mirror? Or are we talking about us being a hammer? I don't know.
On that, I don't know, which I think is quite honest. Beautifully put. I want to conclude this event. I want to thank the Ageless Film Festival presented by HotDocs and PEN. I want to thank Miss Judy Gladstone. I want to thank our incredible esteemed panel. And I want to thank all of you for taking the time to be part of this discussion. I began this by talking about my own experience in Iran, and I know we've kind of danced around this issue of authoritarianism and freedom and so on. So I just want to conclude this event by echoing the chant that a lot of people in Iran are chanting these days in their call for freedom. Woman, life, freedom, zan zindagi azadi. Thank you all very much.